consider ourselves a society in that we are here for you. We are a membership group, so you help drive what we do. So we like to hear from you. Your dues are important, but your voice is very important as well, and your participation. So thank you for being here. And you help make things available to the general public as well so that we can grow our reach. We are joined by several board members. Some of them are out doing volunteer duty, but if there's any in the room, would you wave? Okay, so everybody with a name tag tonight, if feel free to go up and introduce yourselves, say hi, and board members might come up to you and say hello as well. And Melanie, who most of you met as you came in, I'd just like to say she's out there, our programs and operations assistant, really a right hand to many of us. So we are glad to have her as well. So those of you out on Zoom, we do have, there was a link on the welcome screen to the materials, or you should have had it in your email, but you don't really need them to follow along for the agenda. You'll see all the screen share of the presentation will be screen shared. So tonight we're going to start with our speaker, and then we will move right on into the meeting. We'll have questions for our speaker, for Dr. Lee, and then we'll move right on in. And at the end, you are welcome to stay and chat and get books and get book signings done and such. So I'm very pleased tonight or this afternoon to welcome our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Lonnie H. Lee, who will speak to us today about the Huguenot or Huguenot Anglican Refuge in Virginia, Empire, Land, and Religion in the Rappahannock region, including the connections to Lancaster County and St. Mary's Whitechapel Parish. A native of Wichita, Kansas, Lonnie earned a bachelor's in history from the University of Kansas, a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry from Austin Theological Seminary, and served 4 Presbyterian pastorates in 3 states. He presently lives in Olathe, Kansas, where he has held leadership roles with Heartland Presbytery and taught church history courses at Village Presbyterian Church. Throughout his academic studies and ministerial career, Lonnie developed a long-standing interest in post-Reformation church history, which inspired his in-depth research into the Huguenot diaspora and led to the 2023 publication of the book that he's talking about tonight. You might also recognize Lonnie from our Zoom speaker series during COVID, when he talked about his first book, A Brief History of Belle Isle Plantation, Lancaster County, Virginia, 1650 to 1782. And he introduced us then to the story of Reverend Jean Bertrand. We'll hear a little bit more about him tonight, but Lonnie, we are so glad to have you with us today, and I'm going to start your screen while you get settled up here. Find that, so you should be good.
Karen, thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And I especially appreciate you mentioning my identification with the Princeton Theological Seminary. When I was there, there were some people who kind of thought it was a cemetery. So, you know, there may be some irony in what you say. It is a great privilege for me to be here today. I am a member of this society, but I've never been able to attend a meeting. I'm an out-of-town member, and what a privilege to be here and actually cast a vote. Are you gonna have some votes later? Do I get to cast one? Great, great. I'm looking forward to that. And I'm really thankful for this opportunity to talk to you about my new book, The Huguenot Anglican Refuge in Virginia. Now, when I say Huguenot, I know some of you in your minds are going to have to translate Huguenot, because if you're like me, you grew up hearing about this group of people being called Huguenots. But when I went to England and did some research there and dealt with people who were experts in this field, I noticed that they were all saying Huguenot, which is a little closer to the French pronunciation. So I got into the habit, and so you're going to hear me say Huguenot, and I apologize if that doesn't always ring true for you. We're not moving.
That's me swinging up.
Okay.
Okay.
That was the end of your, so it must have been the
Oh,
last
that-
slide instead of the beginning one.
I did that just to throw you off.
Get to see it all again. Else what's down here. So should go. There we go.
Thank you very much, Karen.
So it happens when you start and end with the same picture.
Yeah, I know. I did that just to make it challenging for you. This research project began with genealogical curiosity about an ancestor. About 20 years ago, I walked into what was then called the Mary Ball Washington Library, asking if they knew anything about John Bertrand. And I was thrilled when a volunteer pulled out a file on the Bertrands and the Belle Isle plantation. That information led me to Belle Isle State Park, which has preserved most of the Bertrand plantation. And later, that same information led me to England and to France to learn more about this ancestor. John Bertrand and his wife, Charlotte Joly, were born in France. They immigrated to England and went to Virginia in 1687. And here you see a contemporary portrayal of a well-to-do Huguenot family offering grace before a meal. It was a 17th century Huguenot who created that work of art, and so he knew exactly what he was doing. Charlotte Joly was a member of an aristocratic French Protestant family like that. Her father was a nobleman, the Seigneur de Chaudenac. Her mother was from a wealthy merchant family. This is her baptism record at the Protestant Church of Caux in France, when she was baptized in 1660 by John Bertrand's father, who was the pastor of that church. This is a scene again by the same artist showing a gathering after a baptism at a wealthy Huguenot family like Charlotte's. In Virginia, John Bertrand served the North Farnham and then the St. Mary's Whitechapel parishes. And in 1692, he and Charlotte purchased Belle Isle and gradually developed a landing for transatlantic ships, a landing that might have looked something like that. The landing was on Deep Creek, and believe it or not, in the 17th century, Deep Creek was really deep. I read all the literature that I could find, but when I looked for the historical context for the Bertrand's immigration to America, I couldn't find anything. Did they come to America by themselves? Why did they choose Virginia? And why was John serving Anglican parishes in Virginia? These were the questions that drove me. And I read all the literature written about Huguenot migration to North America. And once again, I couldn't find any organized migration to Virginia until 1700. And that's 13 years after my ancestors arrived. And that migration was to Manakin, another part of the colony. This book by John Butler is a definitive work on Huguenots in America, written by a Harvard historian. He mentions nothing about Huguenots on the Rappahannock River. But there has been a great deal of historical research and writing about the Huguenot diaspora as a whole. And here you see the escape routes of the approximately 200,000 Huguenots who fled France after 1685. 1685, Louis XIV outlawed Protestantism. And the Huguenots who were not willing to accept Catholicism into their lives had to escape. And this shows you the various directions that they went. And there were some who went overland into Germany and into Switzerland and into the Netherlands. Those who lived on the west coast of France fled by sea, and many of them went to England, but some of them found their way to the Netherlands. But small numbers moved into Scandinavia and even Russia. As I researched John and Charlotte Bertrand in Virginia County records, I was seeing a large number of French surnames in Richmond, Essex, and Lancaster counties, especially along the Rappahannock River, which you see cutting through the center of this map. When I began to cross-reference some of these names in Huguenot archives in England and France, I began finding matches, including a significant number of the Rappahannock people with French surnames being from John and Charlotte's home church in Caux, France. Caux is found along the Gironde River in France. And when I was there a year ago, I noticed how much it looked like the Rappahannock. It was a wide river, as you see from Lancaster County. And I also realized while I was there that the Gironde River, where they came from, also provided the largest estuary in Western Europe. And where did they come? But to the largest estuary in North America. Some things began to add up. Then I found that Virginia's governor, Francis Howard, Baron of Effingham, made an offer to Huguenot exiles in 1686 to entice them to settle in Virginia. You see, there was a sort of pamphlet war going on between Virginia and South Carolina because both colonies needed new immigrants, and they both valued people like the Huguenots who would bring the kind of skills and education level that they represented. So Governor Howard promised land at a reasonable rate and paid positions for one or two bilingual Huguenot ministers. And he stipulated the ministers could preach in French to the exiles if they also preached in English to settlers in established Anglican parishes. Governor Howard's offer was published in Europe in this French language pamphlet in 1687. What you're seeing on the screen is a translation of that French language pamphlet that was done and published in America in the 1930s. So 5 months after this pamphlet was published at The Hague, John and Charlotte arrived in Virginia, with John filling one of the bilingual ministry positions. Over time, I was able to determine that John Bertrand was the first of 5 French exile ministers to serve in one of Governor Howard's dual-track ministry positions in the Rappahannock region. And I've coined the term Huguenot Anglican to describe these ministers and their work in Virginia. So you also see, as you look at this list, if you can read it in the back, James Bousseau, we don't know much about him. Nicholas Moreau was here about 4 years in South Farnham Parish. Louis Latané, who had a long ministry in South Farnham Parish. And later, James Maury, who went to St. George's Parish. And Maury's particularly interesting because he wasn't truly a Huguenot. He was too late to have been thrown out of France with the Huguenots, but he was a Catholic priest who decided to leave France and went to England and became an Anglican minister. And when they found out he was bilingual, they said, "Oh, we need you in Virginia." So they sent him here to do this bilingual ministry. My research ultimately provided a detailed picture of a large Huguenot migration to Virginia, beginning in 1687, initially led by John Bertrand. This map shows where more than 300 families settled along the Rappahannock River, encompassing some 8 counties. This refugee community remained hidden to historians for almost 300 years. They were hidden first because there was no Huguenot town. There were no towns in 17th century Virginia, right? They were also hidden because there was no Huguenot church. If you came to Virginia, you had to be an Anglican. And when people got on the boat in England that was bound for Virginia, they knew when they got off that boat, they were going to be Anglicans. And if they didn't want to be Anglicans, they could get on a different boat that would take them to New England or New York City or South Carolina, where there were independent Huguenot churches not aligned with the Anglicans. And they were hidden because the people, the settlers along the Rappahannock, were welcoming. And they brought their own ministers who led the established parishes, and they assimilated faster than any other Huguenot community in America. The book documents more than 300 Huguenot households and indentured servants along the Rappahannock between 1677 and 1710, making it a unique resource for genealogy covering 8 Virginia counties. In writing the book, I tried to write for a general audience, avoiding the technical language commonly used by historians and theologians. This is the gravestone for Paul McCoe, the only gravestone of an immigrant, 1687 immigrant that I've been able to find in Virginia. It is today at Daughters Episcopal Church. The book covers approximately a century of history from Louis XIV's persecution of Protestants in France during the 1660s to the religious and cultural transformation of Virginia in the 1760s. And then I give particular emphasis on the years of the French migration between 1687 and 1710. We've circulated today a timeline that will summarize that history. I don't have time to really go into that today, but if you're interested in that history, feel free to take the timeline home with you to give you an idea of the historical context of the book. You see here the baptism record of Paul McCoe, and I have him documented from the time that he was born in Caux, France, to the time that he died in Virginia in 1736. McCoe was a physician, and he married into a wealthy English family and became most likely the wealthiest of the first generation immigrants in the Huguenot community. This previously unknown Huguenot migration to Virginia that's documented in the book also appears to be the largest in North America, as illustrated by this chart. And if you can read this, 190 in New England, 184 in New Rochelle, 317 New York City, Charleston, South Carolina, 195, 243 in rural communities of South Carolina, 300 in Mannequin. The Rappahannock region, probably around 1,000 people. The Rappahannock community, of course, is more scattered than these other communities because they're up and down the river, scattered on plantations. But the Rappahannock provided the communication link and the transportation link so that they could create a real community. And when John Bertrand arrived at North Farnham in 1687, we don't know exactly how he practiced his bilingual ministry, but more than likely he had one service in English every Sunday and another service in French. And then people would travel from other counties up and down the river to be present for those French services, whether that might be once a month or once every other month. But the river provided the link for a community to be built. And it appears to be very large by Huguenot migration standards. The book includes a careful analysis of the Huguenot exiles' participation in the controversy over the Northern Neck Proprietary that raged from 1680 to 1698, and how it was finally resolved in 1698. Here you see Charles II issuing the proprietary grant that gave several million acres of the Northern Neck to a group of his supporters. Historians who've already reviewed my book are graciously suggesting that it may generate a reassessment of the size and scope of the Huguenot migration to America, a migration that may well have been much larger than historians have so far imagined. And some of their comments are on the back cover of the book. You see here a map that was published just 3 years ago by a leading Huguenot scholar, and it's showing all the places along the eastern seaboard where Huguenots formed communities, but there's no Huguenot community identified along the Rappahannock. So already out of date after just 3 years. Let's say just a little bit about the publisher for the book. The book is published by Lexington Books Fortress Academic, which is an imprint of the Rowman and Littlefield Publishing Group as part of its Anglican Studies series. Its books are always peer-reviewed, and my book was peer-reviewed by a Huguenot historian. And the publisher is part of a large corporation with international reach that is important for my new book because there's a much larger market for Huguenot studies in Europe than there is in the US. And books produced by this publisher are also expensive hardbacks that are produced for long-term use by libraries and as college textbooks. There are a number of options for accessing the book that you see listed here. The best price on an ebook is the publisher's discount flyer, and we distributed some of those if you're interested in that. The best price on a hardback is the group discount that I was able to get for books that are purchased here today. And by doing a group order, I was able to get that down to $60. I'd much rather have put out a book that more people could buy for $20 or $25. But in order to get this before historians to look at the ways in which this book has the potential to change a particular historical discipline, it was important for me to go this route. And I'm pleased to see already that the library at Princeton University has purchased it. So that's working. But it is expensive, and for that I'm sorry. I brought with me some copies of an article that I wrote last year, but they're already sold out, so I won't even say any more about that.
We'll have one in the library.
There's one in the library. Oh yeah, and I forgot to say that too. Thank you, Karen. I donated a copy of my new book to the library. So you have the opportunity, if you choose not to buy it, you have the opportunity to consult the work in the library. So that's another way for you to look at it. Okay, I'll be happy to respond to any questions that anybody may have and to
Oh yeah,
yes, the cover on the book, as some of you have already noticed, is the Decalogue from St. Mary's Whitechapel Church. And that is dated 1702, just 1 year after John Bertrand's death. Decalogues like this were almost mandatory on Protestant churches in France. Now you find them in England too, and you find them in colonial America, but you almost can't find a Protestant church in France that doesn't have a Decalogue like that. So because it goes back to the time of John Bertrand, and because John Bertrand was at St. Mary's Whitechapel Church, it seemed to me to be the perfect thing to put as a title. And the church was gracious enough to grant me permission to do that. And I appreciate that.
Is there evidence of John Bertrand preaching in French in Lancaster County? Any records of that?
There's no documentation. The documentation we have is the offer made by Governor Howard to say, bring your French minister and they can preach in French just the way they did in France to the new exiles if they preach in English. So we don't know exactly how that happened, but we have to assume that when he came 5 months later, that's why he came. That's the ministry he was having. Now, if people were coming up and down the river, they probably had too many people to fit inside with the Whitechapel Church. They were probably preaching outside for some of the French services because they would have had larger groups of people who were coming in and spending several days to get there and be part of that. Yes.
We've written a book on Bell. Can you tell us a little bit of your interest in that and how that came to?
Yeah, that was part of the same research project. And before I was ready to move ahead with the bigger book on the Huguenot migration, it was clear to me that no one knew much about Belle Isle, and that there were a lot of false rumors floating around about things that might or might not have happened at Belle Isle. So because it seemed to me there was a real need for that kind of a book, and because that's a shorter book, I was able to put that out 3 years ago, and I used Heritage Books, which is a genealogical publisher, to do that, and that's published in paperback, so it's a lot easier to get a hold of it. The second book, because it's more of a scholarly work, and it's jumping through all the hoops that you have to jump through with an academic publisher. There was more work that needed to be done before I could move to that. But there is information about Belle Isle in the second book. And there's more detail about the Northern Neck Proprietary, for instance, that I didn't have room to put into the original book on Belle Isle. And there's some new research about Belle Isle, some things that I put together, and some of the pieces that came together for me after I had published the first book that you will find. So if you're really interested in Belle Isle, the second book has a lot about that as well. Yes.
When he preached in French, would he have been preaching Reformed faith, or would he have been required to preach Anglican faith?
Wonderful question. I'm so impressed by that question. The answer is yes. And the reason I say that is that the Anglicans considered themselves part of the Reformed tradition at that time, particularly the Anglicans who were in Virginia. The Anglicans in Virginia were almost all Calvinists in the late 17th century. That was beginning to change in England, and England was moving away from Calvinism. But Virginia was a good 50 years behind Virginia in doing that. And even in England, where they were moving beyond Calvinism, they still retained, there's a lot of Calvinist language in the Book of Common Prayer. If you go back to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, there's a lot of Calvinist language that's in it. So, but the book really pursues that question in a lot of detail and looks at issues of Calvinism and the various controversies around Calvinism. And there were controversies around Calvinism in France among the Huguenots. There were controversies in England. There were controversies here. And the French ministers were coming here trying to bring the Anglican reform that the Bishop of London wanted to implement in Virginia. But the hardest part of that Anglican reform was to break down the power of the vestries, because in Virginia, there were no bishops, and the vestries ran the show. They hired ministers, they fired ministers, they decided what kind of worship to do. But what the research that's been done on Huguenots in America generally shows that they embraced, and this is true in New York, it's true in South Carolina, they embraced the Anglican Church, but they kept preaching Calvinism. So they brought them together. They didn't see them as things that they didn't feel like they had to choose between them. Yes.
And that situations, as I was looking over some of the literature here, and I kept running across names like Slatton, and that he's obviously gradually speaking of art. And my baby name was Sale. And yet I know it's my kin on the sales side as well as the two. Lewis, Tratnik are similar. Came from down here, I mean, in this area where.
Okay.
Could they have been here?
Absolutely. If they came from this area, they probably were. And especially, I think
So would be Lachette.
what exactly. And I found a family of that name that was in that area. Now, whether it was your family, I don't know. But I have lists. I have lists in the appendices of the book of names documented and also showing some of the variants, some of the French variants of those names. So it's very possible. For Richmond County, Essex County, they were really the center. There are quite a few in Lancaster, but Richmond and Essex are the center. And then it moved up into Stafford. And then later, second generation Huguenots, they started moving up to Stafford. So, which is what a lot of other people were doing too. So
That's really interesting because my father died at age 52. He would have just gone crazy trying to run this down. And when I moved from West Virginia, there was one person in the male female in the front with the last name Sager. When I came down here, it's all over the place. So it does tell me that
yes,
what you say is true.
yes.
The story you tell in the books about how if you were an Anglican and you wore vestments, but the others, the Calvinists were born sometimes to have the black robe, and that when you were conducting the liturgy, you had the Anglican stole, but when you took to the pulpit, you put on a black robe. Was that pretty common among the?
Yeah, that was pretty common in the 18th century. And I raise it because there's a record that indicates John Bertrand was wearing the cream colored surplice starting in the 1690s. And that was radical. I think that was very radical for this area. And the information I have about the ministers who preceded him at Whitechapel would indicate they were Presbyterian oriented. They were either English Presbyterians or Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and that they would have worn the Geneva pulpit gown. And I suspect that Bertrand was a bit controversial because he knew more about what the Bishop of London wanted done, and he was introducing the surplice, which probably didn't go over well with everybody. Yes.
What was the nature of the persecution in France that was aimed at
the Louis XIV, as the King of England, decided that he wanted everybody to have his religion in 1685. And oddly enough, there had been almost 100 years of religious freedom in France, which is unheard of in Europe. But Henry IV, in the Edict of Nantes, it created a degree of religious freedom for Protestants, and that held for the better part of a century until Louis decided no more, and he outlawed Protestantism, burned down all the Protestant churches, kicked out all of the ministers, and said to the lay people, you may not leave, and if you get caught leaving, you're going to row a galley the rest of your life or be in jail. And so the 200,000 who got out, despite being threatened with the galley and jail, is kind of amazing. But short answer to a much bigger question. So,
They were escaping for their lives in some.
well, once they decided to escape, then their lives were in danger. Once they decided, if they decided to stay and play along and act as if they were Catholic, and some people sort of played along with that, they were not subject to persecution if they did that. If they gave up their freedom of conscience, they could escape that. Yeah.
And your presentation, you referenced, I think what you call a pamphlet on Huguenot exiles in Virginia, voyages of Virginia and Maryland. Where can you find that pamphlet? Is that in the museum?
I don't know. Many libraries will have it. The Library of Virginia, I'm sure, will have that. It's pretty well known among historians. And many Virginia historians have quoted that pamphlet because it's one of the very few contemporary descriptions of Virginia in 1686. But they didn't get out of it what I got out of it.
What else are they enticing people with?
Land. It was mostly land, but that is a book.
Slide back on so we can get the full title. Yeah, I'll find it.
Yeah.
And
It's her computer. She knows how to find it.
Some just don't write that fast.
That's right. Well, and it's in my book, so you can find it in my book. If you look it up at the library here, and that's it. Durand, the Dauphiné, Durand.
And that
We would call Durand.
yeah, I would say that,
Durand. Durand.
yeah, when Lonnie
The
first
French.
came, I think probably the first day he came to the library, he said Bertrand, and we all went, who? Oh, Bertrand. Okay, we can tell you some things about that. But so put us in the mindset a little bit of Jean and Charlotte, kind of their life here. Kind of, I think some of the things from the Belle Isle book, or in addition to being the minister, like what's their life like?
Yeah. Well, John and Charlotte were merchants, and they came from merchant families. And one of the really interesting things to me is that Charlotte was an outstanding businesswoman. And if you read my first book, you'll know that. And when John Bertrand died, she took over the plantation. But she wasn't just running a plantation, she was running an international trading operation. And she was following the example of her mother. I found a record of her mother in France selling vines to another merchant. And she signed it in 1692, her mother did. But in Western France, where the Bertrands came from, merchant women were always working in partnership with their husbands. And when the husbands died, the women inherited the businesses. So this is a piece of French culture that they brought with them. And we know that however Charlotte tried to assimilate to English culture, she didn't become a good, proper English wife. She was in court duking it out with some of the most powerful men in the county. That's how she did business. That's how she learned from her mother. And I found a fascinating French record of a guy who was a druggist, and he was training these young men to be druggists. And then he died. And then the court said, okay, his wife can train them. And they're these young men now are learning from the woman who was the wife of the druggist, and that's considered perfectly proper in that French society. But a big piece of the controversy around Belle Isle in the Northern Neck Proprietary was the Bertrands trying to increase the size of Belle Isle so that they would have room to build a tobacco landing and have the space that they needed to have an international trading operation. However busy John Bertrand may have been in his work as a clergyman, he was also a businessman as well, as was Sherwin. Yes.
Did you read French already, or did you have to learn that? Did you have that work?
A little of both. A little of both. I studied French in high school and college, so I had some background. And as I got interested in this work and was reading French documents, I improved. I improved a lot.
Well, there's one record was easier to read in French than some of our court record handwriting.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's right. Well, the other thing with research, you know, you're reading a certain kind of document, so you sort of know what to look for in those documents, and you learn the vocabulary around those records. So that makes it a little easier. Yeah.
One of his constant arguments, people he was always in arguments with was Robert Carter.
Right.
Can you tell us a little more about that relationship, the lack of relationship?
Yes, Robert Carter was trying to destroy the Northern Neck Proprietary. And John Bertrand was working for William Fitzhugh, who was promoting the Northern Neck Proprietary. It's pretty complicated. I don't know if I want to get too far into that, but read the book. There's a great chapter in the book that goes into all the detail around this. But there is this cool passage in the Lancaster County records where John Bertrand and Robert Carter get into a shouting match in court. And, you know, how many people had the nerve to do that to Robert Carter? I don't think very many people did that.
Did he influence Robert Carter to then accept the proprietary and become the agent?
No, I don't think so. Robert Carter lost to William Fitzhugh, and then later he became the agent when he found that was to his advantage to do so. But this explosion in court between Bertrand and Carter, when I saw that, I thought, gosh, there's got to be a story there. There's got to be more than what they're telling you. And Bertrand gets fined for behaving badly, and they said his scandalous behavior in court. And but all of this follows right after Robert Carter lost in his effort to dismantle the Northern Neck Proprietary. And William Fitzhugh, that was really a battle between Fitzhugh and Carter. And Bertrand was sort of a pawn. He was a small-time operator in that whole fight. But he was on the wrong side as far as Robert Carter was concerned. So there was no love lost between them.
How about Mannequin Town? So that's outside of the Richmond area.
Yes,
Did you find any connections?
absolutely. There are connections. There are also great differences. The Rappahannock Huguenots, almost all of them came from Western France. And they were merchants, they were seamen, they were in the wine business. So you can find all these connections to Western France. The ones who went to Mannequin, and that was later, most of them were from the east of France. And the ministers who went to Mannequin were from eastern France. And there's no evidence that they were bilingual. They were leading a French parish and just had to preach in French. So that was different. The other difference is that the ones who went to Mannequin were poor. They had to farm. They were out in the wilderness. And they had no choice but to farm. And it took them a long time to get established. And it took a lot of charity to keep them alive. Along the Rappahannock, these Huguenots came with resources, and many of them came with good trading connections to England and France and up and down the eastern seaboard of the colonies. And they pretty quickly assimilated into the Virginian aristocracy. And not all of them, but some of their leaders did. And they had economic opportunities that were not available to the Huguenots at Mannequin. But the other place that's interesting is that I found a number of the people who went to the Rappahannock were coming on the same ships with the people who went to Mannequin. And so I can document them from those ships, then into Essex County or into Lancaster County or into Richmond County. So it's always been a bit of a mystery that there were 300 people who went to Mannequin, but there must have been about 1,000 who came on those ships. And where did the others go? Well, I found maybe 100 of them who came into this area. And so I've listed them in my appendix as part of sort of this third wave that came after 1701. And it's likely that a good number of those were on those ships. And maybe 8 or 10 of them I can prove were on those ships that came in 1700 and 1701.
So they know each other. I mean,
Yes.
it's not just they're coming in groups and so they're writing letters back and people had a year or
Exactly. Though some of them came on those ships and they knew where they were going, and they knew they were going to go along the Rappahannock, and they were going to link up with friends and relatives who were already there and already established along the Rappahannock. So their prospects were much better than the ones who just plopped down in Mannequin, and they said, "Okay, go grow some food for yourselves," and they knew nothing about farming. And they had a tough time, a really tough time.
So are those along the Rappahannock? I mean, there's not going to be as you said, they're not towns, or there's not all that many ports. So are some of them becoming the landowner, larger farmer, not the subsistence farming, but they're wealthy enough to own the larger plantations, and that becomes their
Some of them
living?
came. Well, I think they weren't owning larger ones, but they were maybe middling planters. And they came with enough resources to buy land. Some of them did not. I mean, some of them came as indentured servants. And I've been able to document maybe 50 some who were indentured servants. And of those, I've got about 9 that I can prove that they survived being an indentured servant and they got their freedom. Others, we don't know. We don't know what happened to them. But there was a variety. Many of the Rappahannock Huguenots came, they were already merchants. They were from merchant families. They were probably being factors of their families in England. They were representatives of their families who already had merchant businesses operating there. Some were physicians, some were teachers, some were ministers. That they brought skills that were very much needed along the Rappahannock. And I've also found that from that church in Cowes, where the Bertrands and the McCows were from that church, there were also people from that church in Boston, in New York City, and in South Carolina. And so they knew people up and down the eastern seaboard, and they knew people who were already merchants in America. So they were doing intercolonial trade between Virginia and New York, Virginia and Boston. And they had all these contacts when they arrived. So many of these people, I mean, they were already citizens of the Atlantic world because they were living along the Atlantic in France and engaged in trade. And they just went to the other end of their trading lines when they came here. But there's a variety. There are people you would consider upper class, middle class, lower class that were part of that migration. But But the ones you find in the records, a lot of the ones in the records were pretty successful and either got here with resources or they gained resources quickly and they intermarried very quickly. Paul McCoe, first generation immigrant, marries into a wealthy English family. By the second generation, probably the majority of them were intermarried with English families. But another reason why historians didn't find them, they mixed in pretty quickly, and they found a place.
How did the Bertrands acquire the property in Canada?
They bought it. They bought the plantation with 500 acres, and then through the Northern Neck Proprietary, Bertrand received 420 more acres later. The original purchase was 1692. The other 420 acres came in 1698 after William Fitzhugh successfully outdueled Robert Carter. And then Fitzhugh was able to give Bertrand 400 more acres, which probably was because Bertrand had been working with him, helping with that process. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but there's a lot of detail in the book.
Are they enslavers to the?
They are, by all means, they are. They're no different than their English neighbors. That if they're able to afford to be enslavers, they're doing it. The only slight difference, and I'm careful about saying it because it's maybe not hugely important, but in the French Reformed Church, there was a policy that emphasized that anyone who is an enslaver should treat the enslaved with great respect and care. And there's some evidence that some of the Huguenots did, that they were more gracious and more careful and more respectful in treating the enslaved. But I'm sure that wasn't universally true. I just found a few examples that point in that direction. But
Also, I'm thinking about Mary Washington because I think about her all the time. But she was, a widow who didn't get married again, and she, of course, had contact with Marie and at church and everything. And so I'm just wondering, how much of a influence all of these French with their own cultural, background with these stronger, I shouldn't say stronger, but women who had different roles than the English, a lot of the English women. And I'm just wondering what kind of influence that might have had on.
yeah, it's a great question. And, there's no documentation that can really tell us much about that. But it's an interesting thing to think about is how did the English women relate to the French women? And did they say, oh, isn't that awful? Or did they say, oh, no, maybe we should try some of that? Don't know. But Charlotte remained a widow. She did not get married. She undoubtedly could have, but I suspect that she didn't want to give up the power she had over that business. That for her to get married would have meant giving a man some power she didn't want to share. That's my best guess.
All right, well, we have a couple questions. Will you share the timeline with me so that folks on Zoom I can link it and they can download it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Some of these I can send to you later. Do you know anything about Francis Mary and the Swamp Fox? Was he a Huguenot?
I've heard that he is, but I don't know anything about it.
Okay, and do you cover the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in your book?
Just a very quick reference, but that's too early. That's too early for my book. I started about it almost a century later.
And then the last one, were the exiles consistent throughout France, or were some areas more or less hostile to Huguenots than others? This person's ancestors came decades later to North Carolina. So he's saying, were there some pockets of safety in France?
Yes, there were, relatively speaking. And southern and western France had large Huguenot populations. And so there was some safety in numbers. The town of Caux, where the Bertrands came from, and Paul Macot and a couple dozen more of the immigrants that I can document, that town was 80% Protestant. And I've been able to document that by pulling the baptism records of the Catholic Church and the baptism records of the Protestant Church. So that's an illustration where Protestants really controlled the town until Louis XIV started to break that down. So there were big differences. Some areas of France, there were very few Protestants. Some areas of France had Protestant majorities, but overall, the Huguenots were never more than 10% of the population of France. So they were always a persecuted minority.
Long do they stay in England before coming here?
Well, it varies. We know that John Bertrand was in England for 10 years and he left early. He didn't wait for Louis to lower the boom. He left early. So he knew English really well. Most of the refugees, it looks like they were in England maybe a year or two or three and then came on. And they had a hard time making a living in England. And so coming to North America gave them opportunities that they didn't have. There were 50,000 Huguenot refugees focused in England, and many of them right around London. So they were sort of crowded.
Actually, the Puritans did a similar thing. They escaped to the Netherlands and then came to.
Right. Yep.
All right, thank you, Lonnie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So after Lonnie will have his book, he'll be around. I have something for you though. Historical Society. Ammon was president during an earlier